At dawn, the broken stones of Hattusa still watch the Anatolian plateau, silent now, but once the heart of an empire powerful enough to challenge Egypt, shake Babylon, and command kings through oath and treaty. The Hittites were not a forgotten tribe in the mountains. They were one of the great forces of the Bronze Age, and then they vanished so completely that history almost lost them. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If ancient mysteries and lost civilizations are the kind of stories you enjoy, at dawn, the stones of Hattusa look less like ruins than the bones of something too large to understand at first glance. The wind moves over the high plateau of central Anatolia, crossing dry grass, broken walls, and empty gateways where lions still stare from carved blocks with blank, weathered faces. The city is silent now, but it was not built for silence. It was built for commands, processions, messengers, sacrifices, royal announcements, and the heavy turning of an empire whose name once carried weight from the mountains of Anatolia to the plains of Syria. Here, in a place that seems remote to modern eyes, a Bronze Age power rose high enough to challenge Egypt, strike fear into Babylon, bend kings through treaty and oath, and nearly rule the world it knew. Then it vanished so completely that for centuries its very existence became little more than a shadow in other people's records. The mystery is not that Hattusa fell. Cities fall often in ancient history. Walls burn, dynasties fail, armies lose, droughts come, roads empty. The deeper mystery is how a kingdom so vast, organized, and dangerous could disappear from common memory so thoroughly that later generations walked near its stones without knowing what kind of power had once lived there. Its kings had written thousands of tablets, its diplomats had negotiated with pharaohs, its armies had carried war chariots across lands that every great state wanted to control. Its scribes had preserved laws, myths, prayers, inventories, rituals, treaties, and anxieties in clay. Yet for a long time, the Hittites seemed almost unreal, a name surviving in fragments, mentioned in ancient texts but not fully understood. What survives in the record suggests a civilization both practical and haunted, a people of fortresses and storms, of military calculation and religious dread, of royal ambition and sudden catastrophe. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of the Hittites is not only the story of a lost empire, it is also the story of how history itself can forget, and how a civilization may lie buried not because it was small, but because the world that remembered it also collapsed. The landscape explains part of the secret. Hattusa does not sit in a soft river valley like many ancient capitals. It rises among ridges, cliffs, and defensive folds of land, in a region of cold winters and bright summers, where the earth can feel both fertile and unforgiving. The plateau is high, the routes are difficult, and the horizons are wide. To the east and south lie passes that lead toward Mesopotamia and Syria. To the west lie roads toward the Aegean world. To the north, harsher lands and restless peoples press against the kingdom's edge. This is not a gentle centre of civilization in the old textbook sense. It is a place of thresholds, where caravans, soldiers, exiles, merchants, and gods all seem to pass through. From the surviving walls, one can still sense the old intention. The city was designed to impress as much as defend. Massive stone foundations carry mud brick superstructures that once rose far higher than the ruins suggest. Gates were carved with guardians, lions, sphinxes, warriors. Some entrances twist through narrow passages, forcing anyone approaching the city to feel the control of those who built it. the famous Lion Gate, even damaged by time, still gives the impression of power carefully staged. It says that those who enter are not simply walking into a town, they're passing into a royal world, a world where the king stands between the human realm and the gods, and where order must be protected against enemies visible and invisible. Yet Hattusa was not rediscovered as a simple romantic ruin with its story already known. Its identity had to be pieced together. Archaeologists found tablets by the thousands, many written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script borrowed from older literate cultures of Mesopotamia. But the language beneath those signs was not Babylonian, not Assyrian, not the familiar voice of the great river kingdoms. It belonged to an Indo-European language now known as Hittite, one of the earliest written Indo-European languages ever recovered. That single fact is surprising enough. In the clay archives of a Bronze Age Anatolian capital, scholars encountered a linguistic ancestor from a family that would one day include Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Persian, and many modern European and South Asian languages. The evidence remains incomplete in many places, but the tablets change the map of ancient history. A civilization that had seemed peripheral suddenly stood at the center of a much larger story. Still, the tablets do not make the Hittites easy to understand. They reveal a state that is powerful but often nervous, sophisticated but never entirely secure. Royal instructions warn officials about loyalty and negligence. Treaties bind vassals with solemn threats. Ritual texts show endless concern over impurity. Broken vows, offended gods, plague, famine, and omens. Military records show kings campaigning far from home, but also returning again and again to put down rebellions. The Hittite world is not the smooth machine of imperial propaganda. It is an empire held together by pressure, law, fear, negotiation, and the constant movement of royal authority across difficult terrain. That is one of the lesser-known truths about this Bronze Age power. It did not rule like Egypt. Egypt had the Nile, a long ribbon of agricultural stability, a sacred geography that helped concentrate authority. The Hittites ruled from mountains, plateaus, and contested corridors. Their empire depended on alliances, vassal kingdoms, marriage connections, military roads, hostage arrangements, and sworn obligations. Their genius was not only conquest, it was management. They learned how to dominate a fractured world without always absorbing it directly. They could break a rival by force, then preserve him as a dependent king. They could threaten, bargain, adopt foreign gods, and write everything down with a seriousness that suggests they knew how fragile power could be. And fragile it was. The stones of Hattusa carry the strange double image of confidence and vulnerability. The city's defences are immense, yet defences only matter when danger is expected. The archives are extensive, yet archives are useful only when a system needs memory to survive. The rituals are elaborate, yet rituals multiply when anxiety deepens. Scholars still debate many aspects of Hittite life, especially the exact pressures that weaken the empire in its final generations. But the broad outline is clear enough to feel the tension. This was a kingdom surrounded by rivals, dependent on grain, metals, manpower, and loyalty, and forced to play a dangerous game across the entire eastern Mediterranean world. When the Hittite kings look south, they see Syria not as an abstract region, but as the prize that connects empires. Whoever controls northern Syria controls trade routes, tribute, access to cities, and influence over the corridor between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. Egypt wants it. Mitanni wants it. Assyria will rise toward it. Babylon watches from the older lands of the south. the Hittites, from their high Anatolian capital. Push into this crowded zone with a confidence that surprises their enemies. At their height, they are not an obscure mountain people. They are one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age, treated by Egypt as a peer, feared by smaller kingdoms, and remembered in diplomatic correspondence as rulers of a land strong enough to change the balance of the world. But the ground beneath that world is already unstable. Long-distance trade carries wealth, but also dependence. Chariot warfare brings speed and prestige, but requires horses, training, specialists, and elite resources. Palace economies can organize impressive labor, but they can also become brittle. Climate shifts, crop failures, disease, migration, dynastic conflict, and foreign attack do not need to arrive as one clean disaster. Often they come as accumulating pressure, a tightening ring. No single explanation fully accounts for what will happen across the Bronze Age world around 1200 BCE, and that is part of what makes the Hittite story so haunting. Their fall is both local and global, sudden and long prepared, visible in ruins yet still blurred by missing evidence. For now, though, the city still stands in the mind as it once stood in stone. Smoke rises from hearths inside the walls. Scribes press signs into wet clay. Messengers arrive with dust on their clothes and news from distant vassals. Priests carry offerings to gods whose names have been gathered from many lands. Metal workers, farmers, soldiers, servants, and royal officials move through a capital that believes itself necessary to the order of things. Somewhere in the palace world, a king listens to reports from the frontiers, knowing that the empire is wide, the gods are demanding, and loyalty must never be assumed. Beyond the gates, roads run outward into a Bronze Age world that seems permanent because every great kingdom thinks its own system can endure. The stones know otherwise. Hattusa waits across the centuries with its broken lions and buried tablets, holding the memory of a power that nearly ruled the world it understood, then slipped into darkness so deep that only excavation, language, and patient reconstruction could bring it back. To follow that story, the first step is to look past the ruins and enter the older Anatolian world that made such an empire possible, a land of metals, storms, rival peoples, and crossroads, where the Hittites did not appear from nowhere, but rose from a landscape already dense with power. Before the Hittite kings place their seals on treaties and send armies towards Syria, Anatolia is already a world of difficult riches. It is not an empty stage waiting for empire. It is a broken, mountainous peninsula where power gathers in pockets, where valleys open and close like doors, and where every road seems to demand payment in endurance. Snow lies on high passes in winter. Summer burns the plateau dry. Rivers cut through deep country and then vanish toward distant seas. Forests, pastures, copper, silver, timber, horses, and grain exist here, but rarely in one easy place. Whoever hopes to rule this land must understand distance, weather, bargaining, and the stubborn independence of towns with their own gods, chiefs, and memories. Long before the name Hatti becomes attached to a great kingdom, Anatolia is shaped by movement. Merchants cross it slowly, with donkeys, packs, escorts, risk, and calculation. Among the most important outsiders are Assyrian merchants from northern Mesopotamia, who established trading colonies in central Anatolia during the early 2nd millennium BCE. Their records, written on clay tablets, preserve a surprisingly human world of contracts, debts, marriages, taxes, and family complaints. They are traders seeking metal and profit, especially silver and copper, and they leave behind one of the richest documentary windows into Anatolia before the Hittite Empire fully takes shape. The most famous of these merchant settlements is at Kanesh, also known as Kultepe, where thousands of tablets have been found. Caravans arrive carrying textiles and tin, and they leave with silver and other valuables. Tin matters because bronze depends on it, and bronze is the material of tools, weapons, prestige, and royal display. Tin often has to travel through networks far beyond what any single kingdom can control. Great armies and palaces depend on routes vulnerable to bandits, politics, weather and trust. Kanesh also reveals that early Anatolia is not culturally simple. Local rulers negotiate with foreign merchants. Anatolian women appear in business documents. Families are spread between Assur and Anatolia, with agents sending messages about goods and obligations. The evidence remains incomplete, and it mostly reflects literate trading circles rather than every layer of society. But it gives a rare glimpse of a Bronze Age world before empire hardens the landscape. The people living in this world are mixed in language and tradition. The land called Hatti is associated with the Hattians, a non-Indo-European population whose religious and cultural influence remains important, even after Hittite-speaking rulers rise to power. Alongside them are groups speaking Indo-European Anatolian languages, including forms related to Hittite, Luwian, and Palic. The relationship between these peoples is not easy to reduce to invasion or replacement. Scholars still debate how Indo-European languages spread into Anatolia and how different communities interacted. What survives in the records suggests layering rather than a clean break. Old gods remain. Old place names continue. New elites adopt local traditions, and identities form through contact as much as conquest. That layering becomes one of the defining marks of the later Hittite world. The kings who will rule from Hattusa do not erase Hattian religious heritage. They absorb it. They inherit storm gods, sun goddesses, mountain gods, festival calendars, and sacred landscapes already alive with meaning. Anatolia is a place where divinity is tied to weather and terrain. Mountains loom as presences, springs, rivers, rocks, and caves carry religious weight. Later Hittite texts speak of the 1,000 gods of Hatti, a phrase that captures religious abundance and political reality at once. The physical land encourages this fragmentation. Unlike the floodplains of Egypt or southern Mesopotamia, central Anatolia does not naturally pull everyone into one long river system. Settlement is scattered across basins, valleys, and defensible heights. A ruler may dominate one route and still find another road beyond his grasp. A town may submit after defeat and rebel when the royal army has marched elsewhere. Anatolia can make kings rich, but it also teaches subjects how to resist them. War in this earlier world is likely frequent, though the details are often shadowed. Town rulers compete. Fortified sites rise on ridges. Control over routes means control over tolls, metals, caravans, and prestige. The Assyrian merchant texts occasionally mention conflict, insecurity, and disrupted trade, giving small flashes of a political world where local kings matter intensely. No single explanation fully accounts for why one dynasty eventually rises above the others, but the conditions are visible. Wealth from trade strengthens certain centres. Competition rewards leaders who can mobilize warriors, secure alliances, and claim sacred legitimacy. Hattusa itself, before it becomes the Hittite capital, belongs to this older Anatolian landscape. Its site offers natural defences, access to routes, nearby agricultural land, and a dramatic setting suited to royal display. Yet early traditions remember conflict around it. Later, Hittite memory preserves the idea that the city was once cursed after destruction by an earlier ruler, though the exact history behind that tradition remains debated. Hattusa was not simply founded in peace as a blank royal project. It carried an older weight, a sense of violence, taboo, and return. The future Hittite Empire grows from a world deeply connected to Mesopotamia but not controlled by it. Cuneiform arrives through trade, accounting habits, seals, legal forms, and diplomatic patterns come from older literate cultures. Yet Anatolia does not become a copy of Assyria or Babylonia. It takes foreign tools and bends them to local conditions. This ability to borrow without disappearing will become one of the Hittites' great strengths. They will write in a Mesopotamian script, worship gods from many lands, use diplomatic forms recognized across the Near East, and still remain unmistakably themselves. By the time Hittite power begins to consolidate, the land has already taught its harsh lessons. Roads must be guarded, towns must be frightened, rewarded, or married into loyalty. Gods must be honored in their local forms. The rise of Hatti is therefore not a sudden miracle. It is the result of a hard landscape, a crowded political field, and rulers who learn how to turn fragmentation into command. Out of trading colonies, fortified towns, storm gods, old Hattian traditions, and restless royal houses, a new centre begins to form, and once that centre takes hold at Hattusa, the plateau that once scattered power starts to send it outward. Power in Anatolia does not gather like water into a single river. It has to be forced, persuaded, inherited, stolen, and sworn into shape. The early Hittite kingdom rises from this rough political ground, where no ruler can simply announce an empire and expect the valleys to obey. A king must take towns one by one, bind families by marriage, reward loyal men with land, terrify rebels, and convince the gods that his rule is not merely ambition, but order. What later appears as the kingdom of Hatti begins as something more uncertain, a contest among strongholds, royal houses, and war leaders who understand that the plateau can either break a dynasty or make it dangerous. The name Hittite itself is partly a modern convenience. The people who build the empire often call their land Hatti, borrowing the name of an older cultural world already rooted in central Anatolia. Their language, which scholars call Hittite, is known to them as the language of Nesha, linking it to Kanesh, the trading city where earlier Assyrian merchants left their tablets. This detail is easy to pass over, but it matters. The kingdom that rises at Hattusa does not begin with a neat national identity in the modern sense. It grows through inheritance, mixture, conquest, and memory. Its rulers stand in a landscape where older Hattian prestige, Indo-European speech, Mesopotamian writing, and local Anatolian politics are already tangled together. One of the early figures who appears in the shadowy beginning of Hittite history is Anita, a ruler associated with the city of Kusara. His story survives in later copies, which means the evidence must be handled carefully, yet it offers a powerful glimpse of the world before Hattusa becomes the royal heart. Anita is remembered as a conqueror who defeats rivals, takes cities, and destroys Hattusa itself. According to later tradition, he curses the site, warning that whoever settles it again will face divine punishment. The exact historical details remain debated, but the memory is striking. The future capital of the Hittites begins in royal tradition not as a blessed foundation, but as a ruined and forbidden place. And yet the curse does not hold. At some point, the rulers who become the Hittite royal line return to Hattusa, rebuild it, and make it the center of their power. That decision says a great deal about early Hittite ambition. A cursed city can be avoided by cautious men. It can also be seized by rulers who believe their own destiny is strong enough to overcome old warnings. Hattusa offers defenses, roots, symbolic force, and room for expansion. Its high ridges and enclosing walls allow a king to stage authority in stone. To occupy it is not merely to choose a capital, it is to claim mastery over the past. The first great Hittite kings known from the Old Kingdom period do not yet rule a calm empire. Their world is still unstable, personal, and violent. Labana, or a royal title remembered under that name, stands near the beginning of the dynasty's traditions. After him, Hattusili I emerges more clearly, a king whose very name means something like Man of Hattusa, binding royal identity to the restored capital. Under Hattusili, Hittite power begins to push outward with sharper purpose. Campaigns reach across Anatolia and toward northern Syria. The kingdom is no longer only a central plateau power, it begins to test the edges of the wider Near Eastern world. This outward movement is risky. Northern Syria is rich, urban, and connected. It is also far from Hattusa, separated by mountains, passes, hostile towns, and political complications. For a young kingdom to campaign there requires more than courage. It requires logistics, food supplies, troops loyal enough to march far from home, and a royal ideology strong enough to justify distant war. What survives in the record suggests that early Hittite kings are already thinking beyond survival. They're trying to become one of the powers that matter across regions, not merely one more Anatolian dynasty fighting neighbours over roads and fields. At home, however, royal strength remains fragile. Hittite kingship is powerful, but it is not absolute in the effortless way later monarchs sometimes pretend. The royal family is full of dangerous relatives. Nobles command men and resources. Succession can become a crisis. One of the most revealing early documents is associated with Hattusili I near the end of his reign, when the old king addresses betrayal, illness, succession, and loyalty. The tone that comes through is not serene triumph. It is wounded authority. A ruler who has campaigned across lands still has to worry about those closest to the throne. That tension shapes the rise of Hatti from the beginning. The kingdom expands outward while struggling inward. It conquers towns but must keep its own court from tearing itself apart. It borrows the tools of written administration, but personal loyalty remains central. It claims divine favour, but royal blood can become a source of danger rather than stability. Scholars still debate how much power early assemblies, nobles, and royal kin held in practice. Yet the evidence shows that Hittite kings cannot ignore elite consensus entirely. Rule depends on command, but also on recognition. The Hittites learned to build power through institutions as well as victories. Land grants reward service. Officials receive instructions. Garrisons and local rulers help hold conquered zones. Oaths become political technology. In a world without modern bureaucracy, an oath is not decorative language. It is a binding force before gods, ancestors, and community. And breaking it invites not only punishment from the king, but disaster from the divine order. The later Hittite obsession with sworn loyalty has roots in this early struggle to hold together a realm that geography and family ambition keep pulling apart. Religion also strengthens the crown. The king is not simply a military leader. He performs rituals, honors gods, maintains festivals, and protects the relationship between human order and divine favor. This is not separate from politics. If crops fail, if plague comes, if enemies invade, people may ask whether the gods are angry. A king who neglects ritual risks more than private guilt. He risks the legitimacy of the state. In Hatti, power is never only practical. It is sacred, anxious, and constantly maintained. The kingdom that forms around Hattusa is therefore both hard and adaptable. It uses force when needed, but it also absorbs. Defeated towns may be folded into the system. Local gods may be carried into the Hittite pantheon rather than rejected. Foreign scribal habits become royal tools. Syrian campaigns expose Hittite rulers to older urban cultures, and instead of being overwhelmed, they learn from them. Their rise is not the rise of a closed people, but of a ruling house skilled at turning contact into advantage. By the time the early kingdom stands firmly enough to look beyond Anatolia, the essential pattern has been set. Hattusa is the symbolic heart. The king is war leader, judge, ritual servant, and manager of dangerous relatives. The state grows through campaigns, oaths, tribute, and the careful handling of local powers. It is still vulnerable, still rough at the edges, still haunted by the difficulty of ruling a land that resists unity. But something new has happened on the plateau. Scattered strongholds and rival towns have begun to answer, however uneasily, to one royal centre. The stones of Hattusa no longer mark a cursed ruin. They mark the seat of a kingdom learning how to become an empire. The kingdom that grows from Hattusa does not survive by walls alone. Stone can hold back an army for a season, perhaps for a generation, but it cannot make distant governors loyal, cannot stop royal cousins from plotting, cannot guarantee that vassal towns will send troops when the king calls. The Hittites learn early that power must be fastened to men as much as to cities, and in their world the strongest fastener is the oath. An oath is not a polite promise. It is a chain stretched between the speaker, the king, the gods, the mountains, the rivers, the earth, and the dead. To break it is to tear a hole in the moral order of the world. That is why Hittite rule often feels both military and ritual at the same time. The king stands at the centre, not only as commander, but as the one before whom loyalty is sworn. Officials, soldiers, vassal rulers, palace servants, and even members of the royal family may be bound by formal declarations. These oaths are surrounded by curses of extraordinary severity, calling down disease, famine, defeat, sterility, and divine abandonment on those who betray the agreement. To modern ears, such language can sound excessive. To the Hittites, it is practical. A kingdom stretched across rugged lands cannot be held together only by messengers and guards. It needs fear that can travel farther than an army. Yet fear is only one part of the system. The Hittite king also rewards. A loyal noble may receive land, status, captives, plunder, or a position in the royal administration. The warrior elite lives close to the machinery of conquest. Its members are not merely ornaments of the court. They are the men who fight, command chariots, manage border districts, collect obligations, and enforce the king's presence where his body cannot be. Their loyalty is precious because their power is real. No single explanation fully accounts for every arrangement in the Hittite nobility, and the evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in the record suggests a ruling class tied to the crown by advantage, prestige, and constant supervision. The army that serves this system is not a simple crowd of spearmen. At its most visible and prestigious level stands the chariot. In the late Bronze Age, the war chariot is a symbol of elite warfare across the Near East. It demands trained horses, skilled drivers, specialized craftsmen, supply networks, and men who can fight from a fast-moving platform. Chariots are expensive, and that expense matters. They reveal a state capable of organizing resources far beyond the household village. The Hittites become known for chariot warfare, and later sources from the great confrontations with Egypt suggest that they could field impressive numbers, though ancient figures are often shaped by royal exaggeration and must be treated carefully. The Hittite chariot may have differed from some of its rivals in carrying a larger crew, often understood as including driver, shield-bearer, and fighter, though scholars still debate details of battlefield practice. What matters is the broader point Hittite war is organised, technical and aristocratic. It is not merely brave men rushing into dust, it is horse training, road preparation, weapon supply, leatherwork, woodworking, bronze fittings, command signals, and the ability to bring men and animals to the right place before food and fodder run out. The image of the chariot flashing across open ground is dramatic, but behind it lies a quieter empire of barns, workshops, scribes, and storehouses. Iron also belongs to the Hittite story, though not in the simple way older legends sometimes suggest. The Hittites were not masters of an Iron Age empire in the later sense, nor did they suddenly conquer the world with iron weapons while everyone else remained helpless with bronze. That popular image is misleading. In their time, iron is rare, difficult to produce consistently, and often valued as a prestige material. Hittite texts mention iron objects, including ceremonial or diplomatic gifts, and Anatolia's metallurgical traditions were important, but bronze remained central to weapons and tools for much of their age. The surprising detail is not that Hittite armies marched with mass-produced iron swords. They did not. It is that iron already carries symbolic power before it becomes ordinary. A piece of iron in a royal gift exchange can speak of wealth, rarity, and technical knowledge. It can move between kings as a sign that the giver has access to things others desire. In the world of great kings, gifts are never only gifts, they are statements. Gold from Egypt, lapis from distant roots, fine textiles, horses, chariots, carved vessels, and unusual metals all become part of diplomatic theatre. The Hittites understand this theatre well. They live in a world where prestige is measured not just by land conquered, but by the ability to send, receive, display, and withhold rare things. Their law also reveals a civilization more complex than its martial image. Hittite legal texts preserve penalties, compensations, rules about injury, theft, marriage, property, slavery, livestock, and ritual offences. Compared with some older Near Eastern law collections, Hittite laws can appear less dominated by death penalties and more concerned with compensation, though this should not be mistaken for modern softness. Ancient justice remains harsh, unequal, and embedded in hierarchy still. The laws show a state interested in regulating daily life, not merely celebrating royal conquest. They show farmers, animals, servants, fields, families, and disputes over practical things. An empire is made not only in battle, but in the ordinary conflicts that must be settled before they turn into disorder. At the royal level, oaths and treaties become the Hittites' great political art. Their agreements with vassal rulers are carefully structured. They often recount past relations, state obligations, demand loyalty to the Hittite king and his heirs, require military support, forbid hostile alliances, and invoke divine witnesses. The gods are not decorative witnesses at the bottom of a document. They are enforcement, mountains, rivers, storm gods, sun deities, and the gods of both sides may be called to watch. If a vassal rebels, he has not simply made a political choice, he has violated the cosmic courtroom. This treaty culture gives Hatti a reach that armies alone cannot sustain. The king does not need to replace every local ruler. He can bind them. He can leave a familiar dynasty in place while turning it into an instrument of Hittite policy. Such arrangements are efficient, but also dangerous. A vassal king may obey while Hittite armies are near and dream of independence when they are far away. Sons may be more rebellious than fathers. Border states may receive tempting messages from Egypt, Assyria, or local rivals. The Hittite Empire is therefore always listening for disloyalty. Its documents have the watchful tone of a power that knows obedience is never final. Inside Hattusa. This political world creates a constant need for records. Tablets preserve instructions to officials, military obligations, religious duties, and diplomatic texts. The act of writing gives the state memory, and memory gives the king leverage. A man who has sworn an oath cannot easily pretend he never did. A vassal who receives favour cannot easily deny the history recited in his treaty. Written words become another kind of wall, less visible than stone but often more useful. Still, the Hittite state remains deeply human, which means deeply vulnerable. Oaths are demanded because betrayal happens. Laws exist because people break rules. Treaties are written because alliances fail. Chariots are built because enemies gather beyond the horizon. The grandeur of Hatti is inseparable from its anxiety. Its kings rule through metal, horses, documents, curses, gifts, and sacred obligation. But all of it depends on people continuing to believe, obey, and fear. For now. The system works well enough to carry Hittite power outward. From the high capital, the kings of Hatti begin to move between worlds, borrowing from older civilizations, absorbing foreign gods, and shaping themselves into something larger than an Anatolian kingdom. As Hittite power moves outward from the Anatolian plateau, it does not become less Anatolian. It becomes something stranger and more flexible, an empire between worlds. Hattusa may stand among cold uplands, rocky ridges, and storm-swept roads, but its mind stretches far beyond its walls. In the archives of the capital, scribes preserve foreign myths beside local rituals. Kings invoke gods whose names come from different peoples and older landscapes. Diplomatic messages follow conventions shaped in Mesopotamia. Political ambitions pull the kingdom south towards Syria and west toward the Aegean horizon. The Hittites do not simply conquer territory. They collect worlds and then try to govern the tension between them. This is one reason their civilization can feel difficult to place on a modern map of the ancient past. They are not Mesopotamian, though they borrow Mesopotamian writing. They are not Egyptian, though they negotiate with pharaohs as equals. They are not Aegean, though their western frontiers bring them into contact with lands that may connect to the world remembered in later Greek traditions. They are not purely Anatolian in the older Hattian sense, though they inherit Hattian gods, names, and sacred customs. Their empire is a layered construction, built in the spaces between better-known civilizations, and for that very reason it becomes one of the great engines of cultural transmission in the Bronze Age. The most visible borrowed tool is writing. Cuneiform comes to Anatolia through older Near Eastern networks, especially trade and diplomacy. By the time the Hittite state becomes a major power, its scribes are using a script with deep Mesopotamian roots to write several languages. Hittite itself appears in cuneiform signs, but the archives also preserve Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, along with Sumerian learned traditions, Hurrian texts, Hattian religious material, Luwian elements, and other traces of a multilingual world. A Hittite tablet is often more than one thing at once: an administrative record, a ritual instruction, a political instrument, and a sign that the kingdom belongs to a wider literate order. This scribal culture requires specialists. Young scribes must learn signs, formulas, languages, and conventions that connect Hattusa to older centres of knowledge. They copy myths whose origins lie far from Anatolia. They record rituals in languages that may no longer be used by the wider population in everyday life. They preserve traditions because the state believes those traditions still have power. The evidence remains incomplete. But what survives suggests a court where knowledge is practical, sacred, and international. A scribe is not merely someone who writes down what others say. He is part of the machinery that allows the empire to remember, communicate, and claim legitimacy among other great powers. Religion shows the same hunger for inclusion. The Hittites famously speak of the 1,000 gods of Hatti, and although the number is poetic rather than statistical, the phrase captures the feeling of their sacred world. Local Anatolian deities remain important, especially storm gods and sun goddesses. Hurrian gods from northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia enter the royal pantheon. Mesopotamian divine names and myths circulate in learned contexts. When the Hittites conquer or absorb a region, they may also absorb its gods, sometimes bringing divine statues, rituals, and priestly traditions into their own religious system. To modern thinking, this may seem like confusion. To them, it is strategy and reverence combined. A god neglected can become dangerous. A conquered land still has divine owners. A city's deity is not a harmless symbol, but a real force in the political imagination. The Hittite king must honour the gods of his own land and respect the powers attached to lands he dominates. This creates an empire that is religiously crowded and administratively demanding. Festivals must be performed, offerings must be correct. Ritual mistakes can have consequences when plague or famine strikes. The royal court may search the past for forgotten offences, broken vows, or neglected cults. Scholars still debate how ordinary people experience this religious abundance, but at the level of the state, it is clear that divine management is part of imperial management. Syria deepens this complexity. The cities of northern Syria are old, wealthy, and connected to the broader Near Eastern world. They bring the Hittites into contact with Hurrian culture, establish scribal schools, international diplomacy, luxury goods, and strategic rivalries. Control over Syrian vassals gives Hatti access to prestige and resources, but it also exposes the empire to competition from Egypt, Mitanni, and later Assyria. The Hittites must become fluent in the political language of the great kings. They must send gifts, demand loyalty, arrange marriages, exchange messages, and understand the etiquette of insult and honour. A poorly judged word between kings can carry the weight of a military threat. In the West, the picture is more shadowed. Hittite texts mention lands such as Azawa, Ahiyawa, and Wilusa, names that have drawn great attention because some may connect, in complicated ways, with the Aegean world and later memories of Troy. No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence, and scholars still debate the exact geography and identity behind some of these names. But the larger point is not disputed. The Hittites are aware of powers and peoples to the west, and their empire is not sealed off from the Aegean. Diplomatic and military concerns reach toward the coast, where local kingdoms, sea routes, and foreign contacts create another frontier of uncertainty. This position between worlds gives the Hittites advantages. They can borrow chariot techniques, scribal forms, religious traditions, and diplomatic habits from many directions. They can use Mesopotamian prestige without being swallowed by Mesopotamia. They can learn from Syrian cities while ruling over them. They can face Egypt not as barbarians from the north, but as a great kingdom with its own archives, treaties, royal ideology, and international standing. Their strength lies partly in adaptation. They do not need to invent everything. They need to recognize what can be used. But the same position creates danger. An empire that connects worlds also depends on worlds remaining connected. Trade routes must stay open. Vassals must remain obedient. Foreign courts must keep treating Hatti as a peer. Scribes must keep copying. Messengers must keep travelling. Horses must keep moving. Gods must keep receiving their offerings. The Hittite system is rich because it is connected, and vulnerable for the same reason. If Syria rebels, the southern balance trembles. If western lands rise, attention is divided. If Assyria grows stronger, old arrangements become unstable. If climate or famine strain supply, distant obligations become harder to maintain. For now, however, the empire between worlds is rising toward its most astonishing displays of power. Its kings have learned to speak in many political languages at once. They can present themselves as guardians of Anatolian sacred order, masters of vassal treaties, equals of Egypt, heirs to older Near Eastern literacy, and rulers capable of reaching far beyond their plateau. The roads from Hattusa no longer lead only to neighbouring towns. They lead toward Babylon, Syria, Egypt, and the contested edges of the Aegean. And one of those roads will soon carry Hittite ambition into an act so bold that later generations could scarcely ignore it, a northern kingdom striking at the ancient heart of Babylonian glory. The road from Hattusa to Babylon is not a straight line on a map so much as an act of imagination hardened into war. Between the high Anatolian capital and the old cities of southern Mesopotamia lie mountains, rivers, enemy territories, supply problems, heat, disease, and the simple difficulty of keeping an army alive far from home. For a young kingdom still securing its own plateau, Babylon should have been almost too distant to touch. It was not merely another city, it was a name with weight. A seat of old kings, temples, scribes, law, trade, and memory. To strike Babylon was to reach into the heart of the older civilized world and prove that power no longer flowed only from the great river plains. That is why the Hittite raid on Babylon remains one of the most startling episodes of the early Bronze Age political story, even though the details survive imperfectly. The campaign is associated with Mursili I, a Hittite king who continues the aggressive expansion begun under earlier rulers. By his time, Haiti has already looked towards Syria, and Syria is the necessary bridge. A king cannot simply leap from Anatolia to Babylon. He must move through contested northern lands, through cities whose loyalties shift, through regions where old powers still believe they can resist him. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests that the Hittite march southward was not an isolated adventure. It grew out of a larger struggle to dominate the routes and cities that connected Anatolia to the wealth of Mesopotamia. Babylon itself, by then, is no longer at the height it had known under Hammurabi, yet it remains a symbol of enormous importance. Hammurabi's dynasty had built a kingdom remembered for law, administration, and royal ambition. But after his reign, the political structure weakened. Southern Mesopotamia faced internal pressures, regional rivals, and shifting control. Still, weakness is not the same as insignificance. A fading royal house can still possess sacred prestige. A city past its peak can still be rich enough to tempt distant kings. The Hittites did not need Babylon to be invincible for the attack to matter. Its very name made the raid extraordinary. The campaign seems almost unbelievable because it does not result in a lasting Hittite occupation of Babylon. Mursili's army strikes, sacks the city, and withdraws. The Hittites do not remain to govern southern Mesopotamia. They do not turn Babylon into a distant province of Hatti. Instead, after the blow falls, they return north. This makes the episode feel less like conquest in the later imperial sense, and more like a violent demonstration of reach, prestige, and disruption. No single explanation fully accounts for the decision to attack so far and then leave, but several motives are plausible. There may have been strategic reasons tied to Syrian politics. There may have been the lure of plunder. There may have been the royal glory of humiliating a famous dynasty. Ancient kings often understood symbolic victories as practical victories, because reputation itself could frighten enemies and strengthen allies. The consequences, however, were larger than a raid alone. The sack of Babylon is traditionally linked to the end of the first dynasty of Babylon, opening the way for Kassite influence and eventual rule in Babylonia. The Hittites did not build a Mesopotamian empire from the ashes, but their attack helped break an old order. It is one of those moments in ancient history when a power appears suddenly, violently, and then withdraws, leaving others to inherit the changed landscape. The Hittites entered Babylon as destroyers, not administrators, yet their blow helped reshape the political future of the region. There is a strange irony here. The Hittites become famous among specialists as a power of treaties, careful diplomacy, and written obligations. But one of their early international acts is remembered as a stunning long-distance assault. This dual nature runs through their history. They can be methodical and ritual-bound, anxious over correct procedure, legal language, and divine approval. Yet they can also move with breathtaking aggression when opportunity appears. They are not a cautious mountain kingdom hiding behind its walls. They are willing to project violence across the known world, even when the logistical risks must have been immense. Those risks should not be underestimated. An army travelling from Anatolia toward Babylon has to feed men and animals over hundreds of miles. Grain must be seized, stored, or carried. Water sources matter. Horses need fodder. Chariots require maintenance. Troops marching through hot lowlands after the uplands of Anatolia face exhaustion. Communication with the homeland becomes slower and more uncertain with every mile. A campaign of this kind demands either a chain of support, ruthless extraction from conquered lands, or both. The fact that the Hittites could attempt it suggests that their early state had already developed serious military organization. It also suggests something about the ambition of Hittite kingship. Mursili I is not content to be a local ruler. He acts as if Hatti belongs in the contest of great powers. This is a mental shift as much as a political one. A kingdom becomes an empire first by imagining that distant lands are within its rightful reach. Once that idea takes root, geography changes. Mountains become roots. Foreign cities become targets. Old civilizations become rivals rather than remote legends. Babylon, seen from Hattusa, is far away. Babylon, seen through the eyes of an ambitious Hittite king, is a prize waiting beyond a chain of campaigns. And yet victory abroad does not protect a king at home. The aftermath of Mursili's reign reveals the dangerous instability already present in the Hittite royal house. After returning from his great campaigns, Mursili is assassinated, reportedly through palace conspiracy. The precise details are filtered through later accounts and political memory, so caution is needed, but the broad message is clear. A king can sack Babylon and still be vulnerable in his own court. He can shake the older world and still fall to the intimate violence of dynastic politics. This is one of the most revealing contradictions in the rise of Hatti. The kingdom has the capacity to strike at legendary cities, but its internal order remains fragile. Expansion brings glory, plunder, and prestige, but it also strains succession, loyalty, a noble ambition. The very men who benefit from conquest may become dangerous when the king weakens. The royal family is both the source of legitimacy and a nest of potential rivals. Scholars still debate the exact sequence of early Hittite succession crises, but the pattern is unmistakable. The empire's outward reach often exceeds its inner stability. The raid on Babylon therefore stands as more than a dramatic military episode. It is a glimpse of what the Hittites could become, and of what might undo them. They could move farther than expected, challenge older centres, and alter the balance of power across regions. But they also carried within their royal system the seeds of disorder. Their enemies were not only in foreign cities, they were sometimes inside the palace, inside the family, inside the oath-bound world that always feared betrayal because betrayal was never imaginary. When the dust of Babylon settles, the Hittites do not yet rule the Near East. They have not nearly mastered the world, but they have announced that they cannot be ignored. From this point onward, Hatti is no longer simply an Anatolian kingdom rising among mountains. It is a force that has touched the deepest symbols of Mesopotamian power and survived the journey back. The old shadow of Babylon has been pierced by a northern blade, and every kingdom watching the routes between Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia must now reconsider the map. The next great struggle will not be for Babylon itself, but for the lands that connect empires, the cities of Syria, where Hittites, Mitanni, Egyptians, and Assyrians begin to play a dangerous game for the centre of the Bronze Age world. The struggle for Syria begins with geography, but it becomes something larger than geography. It becomes a contest over the nervous system of the Bronze Age world. Northern Syria is not merely a belt of cities between Anatolia and Egypt. It is a region where roads meet, where caravans carry metals, timber, textiles, horses, grain, luxury goods, and news, and where small kingdoms survive by reading the moods of larger ones. For the Hittites, Syria is the open gate to greatness. For their rivals, it is the line that must not be crossed. The kingdom that first stands most directly in the way of Hittite expansion is Mitanni, a powerful state whose heartland lies in northern Mesopotamia and whose influence stretches across northern Syria. Mitanni is less familiar today than Egypt or Assyria, but in its time it matters deeply. Its rulers deal with pharaohs, command vassals, control routes, and draw on a military aristocracy associated with chariot warfare and horse training. Some technical texts connected with horse conditioning preserve Indo-Aryan terms, a surprising detail that has attracted scholarly attention, though it should not be turned into a simple story of migration or conquest. What survives in the record suggests a mixed kingdom, Hurrian in much of its cultural setting, international in diplomacy, and strong enough to block Hittite ambitions for generations. Syria itself is not passive in this contest. Cities such as Aleppo, Carchemish, Ugarit, Alalag, and others belong to a landscape of old urban traditions, local dynasties, merchant wealth, scribal culture, and sacred prestige. These places are smaller than Egypt or Hatti, but they are not helpless villages. Their rulers bargain, betray, appeal, delay, and survive. A Syrian vassal king may kneel before one master in one decade and seek protection from another in the next. This is not simply treachery. It is survival in a world where distance is political opportunity. For the Hittites, the prize is urgent because northern Syria opens the route from Anatolia into the wider Near East. Control over Carchemish on the Euphrates gives access to a strategic crossing and a commanding position between regions. Aleppo carries old religious and political importance, especially through storm god traditions linked to the city. Ugarit, on the coast. connects inland kingdoms to Mediterranean trade. Each city is a key, but none unlocks the region forever. The Hittites must win them, hold them, bind them, and often win them again. Egypt watches with its own deep interests. From the Nile Valley, pharaohs see Syria-Palestine as both buffer and prize, a zone of tribute, timber, roots, and security against northern threats. Egyptian kings campaign into the region, place garrisons, receive letters, and expect smaller rulers to acknowledge their greatness. Egypt's power is immense, but its distance from northern Syria creates a problem similar to the Hittite one. A pharaoh can march north with splendor, but after he returns to Egypt, local politics resumes its patient work. In the middle of this pressure stands Mitanni, often acting as the main counterweight to early Hittite and Egyptian expansion. At times, Egypt and Mitanni are enemies. At other times, they are diplomatic partners linked by royal marriages and gift exchange. Bronze Age diplomacy is rarely fixed. Yesterday's rival may become today's necessary ally if a third power grows too strong. The great kings call one another brothers when relations are good. But brotherhood in royal letters means status and recognition, not affection. The Hittites exploit this world with increasing skill. Their kings understand that Syria cannot be held by brute force alone. A conquered city must be placed within a network of obligation. A loyal local ruler may remain on his throne, a rebellious one may be removed, replaced, or humbled. Hittite princes may be installed in key cities, creating dynastic anchors beyond Anatolia. Carchemish eventually becomes one of the most important Hittite centers outside the capital. Governed by members of the royal family and serving as a southern pillar of imperial power. But every move in Syria provokes another move. When Hatti advances, Mitanni resists or weakens. When Mitanni weakens, Assyria begins to stir more dangerously in the east. When Egypt senses Hittite pressure, it has reason to reassert influence. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise and fall of every Syrian alliance, because the evidence is scattered across Hittite records, Egyptian inscriptions, Akkadian diplomatic letters, and local archives. Yet the pattern is clear enough. Syria is where the Hittites become a true great power, because it is where they are forced to compete with other great powers. The human cost of this game is easy to lose beneath the names of kings. For local communities, imperial rivalry means tribute demands, military levies, shifting loyalties, sieges, hostages, deportations, and the danger of being punished for choosing the wrong master. A city may survive one campaign by opening its gates, then suffer later because the rival empire considers that surrender betrayal. Merchants may profit when routes are safe and lose everything when war closes them. The empire is not an abstraction to them. It arrives as messengers, taxes, soldiers, and fear. One lesser-known feature of Hittite policy is how often religion and diplomacy overlap in this Syrian world. The Hittites do not simply impose a narrow cult from Hattusa. They recognize and sometimes elevate the gods of conquered regions. The storm god of Aleppo becomes deeply important in Hittite royal ideology. This is not only piety, it is political intelligence. To rule a land, one must respect the powers believed to guard it. Whether local populations accepted this fully is another matter. And scholars still debate how imperial religion worked on the ground, but the strategy is visible. Over time, Mitanni's strength erodes, Hittite pressure from the northwest, Assyrian resurgence from the east, and internal dynastic difficulties weaken its ability to dominate Syria. The Hittite king Suppiluliuma I eventually turns this shifting situation into one of the most dramatic imperial expansions in Bronze Age history. He defeats Mitanni influence, brings key Syrian states under Hittite control, and reorganizes the region with a ruthlessness matched by careful political design. Yet triumph in Syria is never peace. Their empire now touches Egypt's zone of influence more dangerously, and Assyria begins to loom as a future threat. By the time the Hittites stand firmly in northern Syria, the road to confrontation with Egypt is no longer a distant possibility. It is built into the geography of empire. The same cities, roads, and vassal loyalties that made Syria valuable now make it combustible. Hatti has become too powerful for Egypt to ignore, and Egypt remains too prestigious for Hatti to dismiss. Between them lie small kingdoms forced to calculate the weather of imperial ambition. The storm that began in the Syrian corridors is moving toward one of the most famous battlefields of the ancient world, where chariots, propaganda, and royal pride will meet near the walls of Kadesh. The road to Kadesh begins long before the armies see the city. It begins in the slow tightening of imperial borders, in letters carried across deserts and mountains, in vassal rulers weighing which great king is more dangerous, and in the old Bronze Age habit of pretending that diplomacy and threat are separate things. By the 13th century BCE, the Hittites and Egyptians are no longer distant powers glancing at one another across a map. They are neighbours by pressure. Their ambitions meeting in Syria, where every fortified town and river crossing can become a test of prestige. Kadesh sits in a position that makes it worth fighting over again and again. Located near the Orontes River, it commands routes through Syria and stands close to the frontier zone between Egyptian and Hittite influence. To Egypt, it is part of the Northern Shield, a place tied to the defence and tribute networks of the Levant. To Hatti, it is a key to holding Syria against Egyptian return. The city is not merely a prize of walls and houses, it is a hinge. Whoever controls Kadesh can claim authority deeper into the contested lands, and in the Bronze Age claims matter almost as much as garrisons, because other rulers are always watching to see which empire appears stronger. Egypt had known periods of deep influence in the Levant before Hittite power rose so sharply. Pharaohs of the New Kingdom marched north, received tribute, and depicted foreign rulers as obedient beneath the grandeur of Egypt. But the Hittite expansion under Suppiluliuma I and his successors changed the balance. Cities that once looked south now had reasons to look north. Vassals learned that Egypt was not the only great power capable of reward and punishment. The Hittite kings, ruling from faraway Hattusa but anchoring their power through Syria, could now compete for loyalty in the same zone where Egyptian kings had long expected recognition. The rivalry is sharpened by memory. Egypt's royal ideology does not easily accept the loss of influence. Pharaohs present themselves as universal victors, chosen by the gods, guardians of order against chaos. Hittite kings, for their part, do not see themselves as provincial intruders. They are great kings in their own right, rulers of Hatti, masters of vassals, heirs to victories over Mitanni, and equals in the diplomatic world. This equality is one of the deepest irritants. A small enemy can be crushed and displayed. An equal must be negotiated with, watched, and feared. In the decades before the famous battle, the political situation around Kadesh shifts more than once. Local rulers change allegiance. Egyptian campaigns attempt to restore influence. Hittite policy seeks to preserve the Syrian system built through treaties and vassal obligations. What survives in the record suggests that both empires understand the symbolic importance of the region. Though the surviving sources are uneven and often shaped by propaganda, Egyptian monuments speak loudly because pharaohs carved their version of events into temple walls. Hittite records are more fragmentary, less public in their surviving form, but they reveal enough to show that Egypt's triumphant story was not the whole story. Then comes Ramesses II, young, ambitious, and eager to assert royal greatness. Early in his reign, he turns towards Syria with the energy of a pharaoh determined to restore Egyptian prestige. He does not march north only to adjust borders. He marches into a political theatre where victory will be seen by allies, enemies, gods, and future generations. Royal warfare is not private policy. It is performance before the world. A pharaoh must be seen conquering. A great king must not appear to yield. The stage is therefore set for danger, because both sides have reasons to avoid humiliation as much as defeat. Opposite Ramesses stands the Hittite king Muwatalli II. He is no passive defender waiting behind northern walls. He understands the stakes and gathers a coalition that reflects the structure of Hittite power. The army that confronts Egypt is not simply a force from the central Anatolian heartland. It includes troops from vassal states and allied regions, a wide imperial muster drawn from the web of obligations Hatti has built across Syria and beyond. This is one of the clearest signs of Hittite achievement. The empire can draw men from many lands and bring them together under royal command, though such a coalition also requires delicate control. Every contingent has its own local interests, its own leaders, its own reasons for obedience or resentment. Kadesh itself becomes a trap of information. Ancient battles are often decided before the first major clash, not only by courage or weapons but by intelligence, speed, deception, and misreading. Ramesses advances with divisions named for Egyptian gods, moving through unfamiliar or contested country. The Hittite forces are concealed near Kadesh, and Egyptian accounts describe false information given by captured men who claim the Hittite army is far away. Whether every detail unfolded exactly as Egyptian inscriptions present it remains debated, but the broad military point is credible. Ramesses appears to have been caught dangerously exposed, with part of his army separated and the Hittites closer than he believed. This is the kind of moment that can break a king. Bronze Age warfare depends heavily on formation, timing, and the controlled movement of men and chariots. A divided army is vulnerable. A royal camp surprised before all divisions are assembled can become a scene of panic. For the Hittites, who have built their strength around coalition warfare, chariot forces, and Syrian strategy, the opportunity is enormous. For Egypt, the danger is not only tactical. If the pharaoh is defeated or killed far from home, the political shock could echo from the Nile Delta to the edges of Nubia and across every vassal state watching Egypt's northern campaign. The landscape around Kadesh therefore holds more than soldiers. It holds the accumulated ambitions of two imperial systems. On one side stands Egypt, river-born, ancient, wealthy, and disciplined in the art of turning royal action into eternal image. On the other stands Hatti, mountain-born, treaty-bound, adaptive, and capable of gathering a northern coalition strong enough to confront the most famous kingdom of the age. Between them lies a Syrian city whose local people must endure the consequences of decisions made by kings claiming cosmic authority. Scholars still debate many details of the battle's opening movements, the size of the armies, and the exact sequence of events. Because the evidence is shaped by royal storytelling and later interpretation, yet uncertainty does not make the confrontation less important. It makes it more revealing. Kadesh is not a simple tale of one side marching nobly against another. It is a collision between propaganda and reality, between what kings want remembered and what the battlefield allows. The Hittites have forced Egypt into a crisis. and Egypt has forced the Hittites into a spectacle no great king can ignore. By the time the chariots begin to move, the question is no longer whether the two powers will clash. The question is how either side will survive the story that follows. The first movement at Kadesh is not the clean collision later monuments prefer to show. It is confusion, dust, speed, and the dangerous distance between what a king believes and what is actually unfolding around him. Rameses advances toward the city with confidence, but confidence on campaign is a fragile thing. It depends on scouts being right, prisoners telling the truth, roads remaining passable, and divisions arriving when expected. Near Kadesh, those assumptions begin to fail. The Egyptian army is stretched out, its separate divisions not yet fully united, while the Hittite king Muwatalli waits closer than the pharaoh seems to understand. The Hittite plan is bold because it uses patience before violence. Muwatalli does not simply throw his army forward at the first sight of Egyptian troops. He allows the Egyptians to move into danger. Hittite chariot forces remain hidden beyond the city, positioned to strike when the Egyptian formation is vulnerable. Ancient sources, especially Egyptian inscriptions, describe captured men misleading Rameses by saying the Hittites are still far away. Whether this deception happened exactly as presented remains debated, but the broader reality is difficult to avoid. Egypt is surprised, and the Hittites use that surprise with frightening skill. When the Hittite chariots finally surge forward, they do not meet an orderly Egyptian army ready for a formal contest. They smash into a force caught in motion. One Egyptian division is struck and broken, and the shock rolls toward the royal camp. Bronze Age chariot warfare is terrifying in part because of its speed. Horses, wheels, leather, wood, bronze fittings, and armed men become a moving weapon designed to tear open formation and morale at once. The Hittites are not vague northern barbarians in this moment. They are disciplined enough to execute an ambush against one of the most powerful armies on earth. The Egyptian camp becomes the center of the crisis. Rameses is suddenly in grave danger, not as a distant commander watching from safety, but as a king whose own position is threatened. Egyptian accounts turn this moment into a heroic scene of near-miraculous royal courage, with the pharaoh standing almost alone against overwhelming enemies. That is royal propaganda. But propaganda often grows around a real wound. The intensity of the Egyptian storytelling suggests that something genuinely alarming happened. The pharaoh's army was caught, his camp was attacked, and the situation came close enough to disaster that later memory had to transform danger into glory. On the Hittite side, the attack seems powerful but not perfectly controlled. Some of the chariot warriors, once inside or near the Egyptian camp, may have become distracted by plunder. This detail appears in Egyptian narratives and may be shaped to explain why the Hittite assault did not finish the job. But it is plausible. Ancient battlefields are not machines. Men who break into an enemy camp see valuables, animals, equipment, and signs of victory. Discipline can fray at exactly the moment success needs to be completed. No single explanation fully accounts for why the Hittites failed to destroy Rameses, but the opportunity slipped. Egyptian reinforcements also matter. Other Egyptian troops arrive, including forces often identified in the records as the Naarin, though their exact identity and role remain debated. Their arrival helps stabilize the crisis and turns what could have been a catastrophic defeat into a battle that continues. Rameses survives. His army does not collapse completely. The Hittites do not capture the pharaoh, and without that decisive outcome, the battle enters the strange zone where both sides can claim something, and neither can claim everything. The fighting around Kadesh is therefore less a simple victory than a failure of finality. The Hittites succeed in surprising Egypt, breaking part of its force, and preventing Rameses from taking the city, Egypt succeeds in avoiding destruction, preserving the pharaoh, and turning survival into a story of divine favor and royal heroism. Kadesh itself remains under Hittite influence after the battle, which is a crucial point often softened by Egyptian monumental art. If the measure is control of the strategic prize, Hatti does not lose. If the measure is whether Egypt is annihilated, Egypt does not lose. The battlefield produces glory, but not settlement. This is what makes Kadesh so revealing. It is one of the earliest great battles for which detailed accounts survive. Yet those accounts are not neutral windows. They are political artifacts. Rameses has the battle carved onto temple walls across Egypt, presenting himself as the heroic center of events. The images are powerful, the pharaoh larger than life, enemies falling, chaos mastered by royal force. Hittite sources do not preserve an equivalent public monument, but the diplomatic and political aftermath shows that Egypt's version cannot be accepted at face value. Scholars still debate numbers, movements, and tactical details, but the larger historical result is clear: Hittite power remains intact, and Egypt does not recover Kadesh. The battle also exposes the limits of imperial warfare. Both states can gather enormous resources, move armies across long distances, and create terrifying moments of violence. But neither can easily turn one battle into complete domination. Egypt is too strong to be removed from the Syrian game by one ambush. Hatti is too entrenched in northern Syria to be pushed back by one royal campaign. The world they are fighting over is too complicated for a single day to solve. Vassals, roads, fortresses, rivers, and rival ambitions remain after the chariots withdraw. For the men who fought there, the result was probably less elegant than later history makes it. Chariot horses exhausted themselves in dust and heat. Broken vehicles littered the ground. Wounded men waited under a Syrian sky, far from the capitals whose royal language would turn their suffering into destiny. Local people near Kadesh endured the presence of armies that consumed food, seized animals, damaged fields, and left fear behind. Great kings measured the battle in honor and territory. Ordinary lives measured it in losses that no monument fully records. Yet the symbolic power of Kadesh grows precisely because it refuses simplicity. It becomes a battlefield where propaganda, survival, strategy, and stalemate all meet. Rameses can return to Egypt and proclaim magnificent personal triumph, and within the logic of Egyptian kingship, survival from danger can indeed be shaped into victory. Muwatalli can preserve Hittite control over the contested zone and deny Egypt its strategic goal, which is victory of another kind. Both statements contain truth, and neither tells the whole truth. After Kadesh, the ancient world does not tilt decisively toward one master. Instead, it learns the cost of balance. The Hittites have proven that they can face Egypt in open imperial confrontation and remain standing. Egypt has proven that even a dangerous surprise cannot easily erase the pharaoh's power. The battle becomes not the end of rivalry, but the beginning of a new understanding, when neither superpower can destroy the other without exhausting itself. The road slowly bends from chariot warfare toward diplomacy. The same world that has just witnessed one of the greatest clashes of the Bronze Age will soon produce one of its most remarkable written agreements, where kings who could not settle everything by battle try to hold the world together by treaty. After Kadesh, the Bronze Age world does not suddenly become peaceful, but it becomes more careful. The dust of battle settles without giving either empire the clean ending royal pride desires. Egypt cannot pretend forever that Syria has been restored to unquestioned obedience. Hatti cannot ignore the fact that Egypt remains wealthy, organized, and capable of sending armies north again. The two powers stand facing one another across a landscape crowded with vassals, messengers, forts, merchants, and anxious local kings. Neither side is weak enough to be dismissed. Neither side is strong enough to erase the other. In that uneasy balance, diplomacy becomes not a sign of softness, but a weapon sharpened by exhaustion. The Hittites understand this better than most. Their empire has always depended on written bonds. From the beginning, they ruled difficult lands through oaths, treaties, royal instructions, and carefully managed obligations. After Kadesh, that habit expands onto the largest stage of all, the famous peace treaty between Hatti and Egypt, made years after the battle during the reign of Hattusili III and Rameses II, is often remembered as one of the earliest known great international peace agreements. That memory is deserved, though it should not be romanticized into a modern vision of friendship. This is not a treaty born from sentimental harmony. It is an agreement between powerful rulers who recognize that endless conflict may cost more than controlled rivalry. The treaty survives in versions from both sides, written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language shared by great courts of the late Bronze Age and known from Egyptian temple inscriptions as well as Hittite archives. The existence of multiple versions itself is revealing. This is not a rumour preserved by one boastful king. It is a formal act in the international system, a document meant to be read, stored, invoked, and remembered. Its language speaks of peace, brotherhood, mutual support, and the return of fugitives. It binds not only the living kings but their successors. It calls gods as witnesses. In Hittite fashion, the written word is never merely ink or clay. It is a structure placed inside the world. Yet the treaty also exposes the anxieties beneath the polished language. Great kings do not promise mutual defense unless they have enemies. They do not agree to extradite fugitives unless fugitives matter. They do not bind heirs unless succession is dangerous. Hattusili III himself comes to the Hittite throne through a troubled path, after conflict within the royal family, and his need for international recognition is one likely part of the diplomatic picture. Rameses, older and secure in his monuments, benefits from a stable northern frontier. Scholars still debate the exact balance of motives, but what survives in the record suggests that both rulers gained something: useful security, prestige, and the ability to focus attention elsewhere. For Hatti, this matters deeply because the empire is never held by force alone. Its Syrian possessions depend on vassal loyalty. Its Anatolian heartland requires attention. Its eastern frontier faces the growing strength of Assyria. Its internal politics remain vulnerable to royal disputes. A formal peace with Egypt helps stabilize the southern system. It tells the smaller kingdoms that Hatti is not isolated. It tells rival great powers that Egypt recognizes the Hittite king as a peer. In the world of Bronze Age diplomacy, recognition is power. To be called brother by another great king is to stand among the few rulers who count. The treaty also reveals a world more interconnected than many modern imaginations allow. Egyptian and Hittite courts exchange messages, gifts, envoys, and eventually royal women. A Hittite princess is sent to marry Rameses II, an extraordinary diplomatic gesture that transforms old rivalry into ceremonial kinship. The journey itself must have been immense, a royal woman travelling from the Hittite sphere toward Egypt with attendants, goods, protection, and political expectations surrounding every step. Such marriages are not personal love stories in the modern sense. They are living treaties. A princess carries her dynasty's prestige in her body, her name, her household, and the sons she may or may not bear. Hittite diplomacy with Egypt is only the most famous example of a wider system. Across Syria and Anatolia, vassal treaties form the real skeleton of the empire. A local king is reminded of favours granted by Hatti, warned against secret dealings with enemies, commanded to send troops when summoned, and required to protect the interests of the Hittite king. These documents can be severe, even suffocating. They reveal a political world in which loyalty must be rehearsed because disloyalty is expected. The Hittite king does not simply conquer a city and forget it. He ties it with words, gods, hostages, obligations, and memory. Some treaties include long historical prologues, retelling how the Hittite king helped, restored, protected, or elevated the vassal ruler. This is not decorative background. It creates moral debt. The vassal is meant to see rebellion not as a strategic option, but as ingratitude against a benefactor. The past is arranged as evidence. The treaty says, in effect, that history itself condemns disloyalty. This is a subtle form of imperial control, and it shows how carefully the Hittites think about power. They know that violence can seize a throne, but narrative can make obedience feel owed. The gods make the arrangement heavier. Divine witnesses are listed, sometimes in great numbers, including the gods of Hatti and the gods of the vassal land, mountains, rivers, heaven, earth, storm gods, sun goddesses, and underworld powers may be drawn into the agreement. This sacred crowd turns politics into cosmic obligation. If the vassal obeys, blessings may follow. If he rebels, curses wait. The language can be grim, calling for the destruction of family, land, crops, and body. To modern readers, such curses may seem theatrical. In the Hittite world, they are enforcement written into the unseen order. Still, a treaty is only as strong as the world around it. Clay tablets can preserve obligations, but they cannot stop famine. Divine curses can terrify a ruler, but ambition may speak louder when the imperial army is far away. A royal marriage may soothe a frontier, but it cannot solve every succession dispute. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet the constant renewal of oaths and treaties suggests that Hittite order required continuous labour. The empire is not a single block of territory. It is a web. Each strand must be checked, tightened, repaired, or replaced. That web gives Hatti remarkable reach. It allows the kings of Hattusa to influence lands they do not directly administer. It lets them turn local dynasties into imperial tools. It permits a mountain capital to project authority into Syrian cities, Euphrates crossings, and frontier states watched by Egypt and Assyria. But the web also carries strain from one end to the other. If one vassal rebels, others notice. If the king dies, loyalty may tremble. If a rival power offers protection, old treaties become tests rather than guarantees. For a time, the system works. Hatti stands among the great kingdoms of the late Bronze Age, not merely because its armies are feared, but because its words have force. Its scribes turn relationships into documents. Its kings turn documents into authority. Its gods turn authority into sacred obligation. The world after Kadesh is therefore held not by peace in the gentle sense, but by managed tension. Chariots remain ready. Fortresses still watch the roads. Messengers still carry warnings. Yet somewhere in the archives, tablets lie drying in the hands of scribes, preserving the fragile idea that rival kings may choose survival over endless war. This is the Hittite genius at its height, the ability to make empire out of agreement as well as conquest. But the same tablets that preserve treaties also preserve something more intimate and unsettling. Beneath the language of kings and vassals lies an enormous archive of rituals, myths, laws, illnesses, omens, and fears. To understand the Hittites only as warriors or diplomats is to see only the outer wall. Inside Hattusa, buried in clay, waits the mind of the empire itself. The empire of Hatti does not speak to the modern world first through gold, tombs, or giant statues. It speaks through clay, beneath the broken walls of Hattusa, in rooms that once belonged to temples, palaces, and administrative buildings. Thousands upon thousands of tablets waited in the earth, hardened by time and sometimes by the very fires that helped destroy the places where they were stored. At first glance, a clay tablet can seem humble beside the monuments of Egypt or the carved reliefs of Assyria. It is small, brown, often damaged, and crowded with wedge-shaped signs. Yet these tablets are among the most powerful remains of the Hittite world, because they do something stone lions cannot do. They let the empire think aloud. The archives of Hattusa reveal a civilization obsessed with order, memory, and danger. They preserve royal treaties, military instructions, legal judgments, inventories, prayers, festival texts, myths, rituals, letters, diplomatic correspondence, and lists of offerings for gods whose names came from many regions. They show that Hittite power did not rest only on chariots and fortified gates. It rested on the ability to record obligation, classify sacred duties, remember past offences, and search for causes when disaster struck. The clay archive is the nervous system of the state, and it is strangely intimate. Through it, the Hittites appear not as distant figures in bronze armour, but as anxious administrators of a world they feared might fall out of balance at any moment. One of the most extraordinary discoveries is linguistic. The tablets preserve Hittite, an early Indo-European language written in cuneiform, alongside Akkadian, Sumerian, Hurrian, Hattian, Luwian, and other traces of the empire's mixed cultural life. This is not the archive of an isolated kingdom. It is the archive of a court that has gathered languages the way it has gathered gods. Scribes move between traditions, copying older Mesopotamian myths, recording local Anatolian rituals, translating or adapting foreign material, and preserving diplomatic language understood by other great kings. What survives in the record suggests a scribal world both scholarly and practical, where writing is a tool of government, but also a means of communicating with the divine. The Hittite laws are especially revealing because they bring the empire down from the level of kings to the level of fields, animals, households, and injuries. They speak of stolen cattle, damaged property, marriage arrangements, slaves, compensation, assault, land, and ritual violations. The society they reveal is hierarchical and unequal, but not chaotic. Penalties are often expressed in payments and restitution, though serious offences can still be treated harshly. The laws do not describe daily life completely, and scholars still debate how consistently they were applied, but they show a state trying to regulate ordinary conflicts before they fracture the social order. Behind the imperial drama of Kadesh and Babylon lies a quieter world of oxen, vineyards, servants, bride wealth, boundary disputes, and practical justice. The ritual texts open an even stranger door. Hittite religion is not a simple set of prayers, it is a vast system of procedures. If a person is polluted, there is a ritual. If a king fears divine anger, there is a ritual. If plague strikes, omens are examined, old offences investigated, and ceremonies performed to restore balance. If an oath is broken, curses may need to be managed. If a god has been neglected, offerings must be corrected. Ritual specialists use water, wool, bread, animals, figurines, fire, vessels, spoken formulas, and symbolic transfers of impurity. Some ceremonies are elaborate enough to feel almost like sacred technology, a set of precise actions meant to move danger away from the community and back into the controlled realm of the gods. This is one of the lesser-known sides of the Hittite Empire. Its rulers are deeply afraid of mistakes. Not only political mistakes, but ritual mistakes, forgotten promises, improper offerings, broken vows, and old crimes hidden beneath the surface of events. When plague devastates the land, Hittite royal prayers search for explanation. The king does not merely ask for mercy. He investigates divine anger like a legal case. Somewhere, an oath may have been broken. Somewhere, a previous king may have sinned. Somewhere, a god may have been dishonored. The evidence remains incomplete, but the emotional pattern is clear. Misfortune is not random in the Hittite imagination. It is a sign that order has been disturbed, and the state must find the disturbance before the land suffers further. The myths preserved at Hattusa show the same concern with loss and restoration. In one famous Anatolian mythic pattern, a god disappears and the world withers. Fertility fails, animals suffer, fires die, and human order weakens until the missing divine power is found and soothed. Such stories fit naturally in a landscape where weather, harvest, and survival are uncertain. They also echo the political world of Hatti itself. A god's absence can endanger the land, just as a king's weakness can endanger the empire. Cosmic order and royal order reflect one another. The archive also reveals the administrative labour behind imperial grandeur. There are lists, allocations, instructions, and records that remind us how much of empire is paperwork. Even in the Bronze Age, grain must be counted, offerings must be supplied, workers must be assigned, horses must be maintained, messengers must carry orders, officials must be warned not to abuse their power or neglect their duties. The Hittites built monumental gates, but they also built procedures. Their greatness lies partly in the unglamorous capacity to make things repeat: festivals, tribute, military service, legal penalties, diplomatic formulas, and the daily habits that keep a palace society functioning. Yet the archive is not complete, and that incompleteness matters. Tablets are broken, some archives burned, scattered, or were never found. Many records reflect the interests of palace and temple elites, not the full experience of farmers, herders, women, captives, and labourers whose voices rarely appear directly. No single collection can give the entire civilization back. Still, the surviving tablets are enough to overturn the old silence. They show a people who wrote constantly because they lived in a world where memory was power and forgetting could be dangerous. In the end, the strange archive underground gives the Hittites back their complexity. They are warriors, but not only warriors. They are diplomats, but not only diplomats. They are legal thinkers, ritual managers, translators, borrowers, organizers, and fearful servants of demanding gods. They try to hold together an empire made of roads, oaths, grain, horses, vassals, clay, and divine approval. For a while, this system appears strong enough to stand among the greatest powers of the age. But the tablets also whisper of strain. Their very abundance suggests how much had to be watched, repaired, purified, and controlled. Beneath the surface of imperial confidence, cracks are beginning to spread behind the throne. Behind the gates of Hattusa, beneath the weight of treaties and ceremonies, The Hittite Empire carries problems that no monument can make disappear. Its kings speak in the language of command, its scribes preserve the language of order, and its rituals promise that impurity can be washed away if the correct words are spoken in the correct sequence. Yet the most dangerous impurities in an empire are not always ritual. They are hunger, rivalry, disease, resentment, exhausted fields, suspicious nobles, restless vassals, and royal families that cannot agree who should sit on the throne. Hatti has risen by mastering a fractured world, but it has never escaped the fractures inside itself. Succession is one of the oldest wounds. Hittite kingship is powerful, sacred, and militarized, but the line of inheritance is not always smooth. Brothers, sons, nephews, queens, royal in-laws, and ambitious officials can become part of the struggle. A strong king may hold them together through fear and prestige. A weak king may find that loyalty, so carefully sworn before the gods, bends under private ambition. The Hittites know this danger well. Their own records remember royal murders, disputed accessions, and the need for formal rules to restrain the violence of the palace. One of the most important reforms, associated with the king Telepinu, tries to regulate succession and reduce bloodshed. But the need for such a decree reveals how severe the problem has already become. The palace is not simply a home for the royal family, it is the centre of the state, the place where military command, religious duty, legal authority, and dynastic legitimacy meet. When violence enters that centre, the entire kingdom trembles. A murdered king does not leave behind only grief. He leaves questions. Which heir is legitimate? Which officials were loyal? Which gods were angered? Which vassals will see opportunity? Which foreign enemy will test the frontier? In an empire held together by personal bonds and sworn obligations, uncertainty at the top travels quickly outward. Queens also matter. Sometimes more than later summaries allow Hittite royal women, especially those holding the title of Tawanana, can possess religious status, political influence, property, and ceremonial authority. This makes the royal court more complex than a simple line of male rulers. Queens may support heirs, shape cult practice, correspond with foreign courts, and remain influential even after a king dies. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact reach of queenly power in different reigns. But the records make one thing clear. The Hittite throne is surrounded by people whose authority cannot be ignored. Disease deepens the strain. Plague appears in Hittite royal prayers with a force that still feels heavy after more than 3,000 years. During the reigns surrounding Suppiluliuma I and his successors, a devastating epidemic seems to have afflicted the land for many years. The Hittites themselves seek the cause in divine anger, especially connected to broken oaths, past sins, and the consequences of foreign campaigns. Modern historians cannot identify the disease with certainty, and no single explanation fully accounts for its spread. But the political effect is easier to grasp. A plague weakens armies, reduces labour, frightens communities, disrupts ritual life, and undermines confidence in royal favour. The irony is bitter. Suppiluliuma I raises Hittite power to astonishing heights, especially through victories in Syria and the weakening of Mitanni, but his reign is followed by illness and instability. Triumph abroad does not protect the land from invisible death. Captives, soldiers, or moving populations may have contributed to the spread of disease, though the evidence remains uncertain. Hittite prayers later suggest that the royal house itself interprets plague as a moral and sacred crisis. The king searches the past for the offence that has brought suffering on the present, In that search, history becomes accusation. Famine and supply pressure may also have troubled the empire, especially in its later period. Hatti is not Egypt, blessed with the relatively predictable rhythm of the Nile. Central Anatolia can be harsh, harvests vary, winters bite, drought can turn difficulty into emergency. The empire's size increases its needs. Armies require grain, horses require fodder, cults require offerings, cities require supplies, and vassals must deliver obligations. When harvests fail or routes become unsafe, the machinery of state begins to grind. There are hints in the wider Late Bronze Age world of food shipments, shortages, and urgent correspondence, though the exact scale of Hittite famine remains debated. The borders add their own pressure. To the north, the Kaska peoples remain a persistent danger, raiding and disrupting Hittite control in the regions near the Black Sea. They are difficult for the Hittites to subdue permanently because the terrain favours resistance, and because imperial attention is often pulled elsewhere. Hattusa itself may at times have been threatened or even temporarily abandoned earlier in Hittite history because of northern pressure. This is a startling thought. The great capital, with all its walls and sacred weight, is never completely beyond danger. The empire can face Egypt at Kadesh and still worry about enemies in the nearer hills. To the east, Assyria grows increasingly formidable. In earlier periods, Assyria is one power among others, sometimes constrained by Mitanni and broader political conditions. But as Mitanni declines, Assyria expands with new force. For Hatti, this creates a serious strategic problem. The Syrian system that once marked Hittite success now becomes a zone exposed to Assyrian ambition. The Euphrates frontier, Carchemish, and the old Mitanni lands become more dangerous. Hittite kings must watch Egypt, manage Anatolia, hold Syria, contain northern raiders, and respond to Assyria's rise. Even a strong empire can become tired when every direction demands vigilance. Internal rebellion completes the pattern. Vassals who swear loyalty may still test the limits of Hittite power. Western Anatolia remains complicated, with shifting states, rival kings, and contacts that may involve the Aegean world. Syria can be held by treaties and royal princes, but not without effort. The Hittite state is wide enough to command many regions, yet that width creates delay. News travels slowly. Armies take time to assemble. A crisis in one frontier may encourage trouble in another. The empire's strength is its network, but a network can fray in many places at once. What makes these cracks haunting is that none of them alone has to destroy Hatti. A succession dispute can be survived, a plague can pass, a famine can be endured, a frontier enemy can be fought, a rebellious vassal can be punished. The danger lies in accumulation. Pressure does not always break a civilization like a hammer striking stone. Sometimes it enters like water through small openings, freezing and widening them season after season, until the wall that seemed solid begins to split. The Hittites have built one of the most sophisticated political systems of the Bronze Age, but sophistication is not invulnerability. By the final generations of the empire, the old confidence is harder to sustain. The treaties still speak, the gods still receive offerings, the scribes still write, the kings still claim authority from Hattusa. Yet the world around them is changing in ways no royal oath can fully restrain. Trade routes tremble, enemies move, harvests fail in some regions, and distant palace systems across the eastern Mediterranean begin to show signs of stress. Hatti is not falling alone. It is standing near the centre of a wider storm, and soon the storm will no longer respect the boundaries between kingdoms. The collapse of the Hittite Empire belongs to one of the most unsettling moments in ancient history. because it does not arrive as a single clean event. It arrives as a widening darkness across the late Bronze Age world, a time when kingdoms that had looked permanent begin to fail in different ways and in different places. Palaces burn, trade routes weaken, archives fall silent, cities are abandoned, destroyed, or reduced. Diplomatic networks that once connected Egypt, Hatti, Assyria, Babylonia, Cyprus, the Levant, and the Aegean begin to tear. For the Hittites, the crisis is not simply that enemies attack, it is that the entire world system on which their power depends starts to break apart. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world enters a period of upheaval still debated by scholars. The old explanation once leaned heavily on invasions, especially the movements of groups often called the Sea Peoples in Egyptian records. These groups certainly matter, and Egyptian inscriptions describe dangerous attacks by peoples moving by land and sea, but no single explanation fully accounts for the scale of the collapse. The evidence remains incomplete, uneven, and local. Some places are destroyed violently, some decline gradually, some survive and change, some powers weaken but do not disappear. The Hittite Empire, however, falls with a severity that makes its disappearance one of the central mysteries of the age. To understand why, it helps to remember what Hatti has become by its final generations. It is not a small kingdom that can withdraw into itself. It is an imperial network stretched across central Anatolia, parts of western Anatolia, northern Syria, and frontier zones watched by Assyria and Egypt. It depends on vassal loyalty, grain supply, military mobilization, tribute, scribal administration, religious obligations, and long-distance communication. This gives the empire reach, but also exposes it to cascading failure. If one region rebels, troops are needed. If harvests fail, grain must be found elsewhere. If trade routes weaken, bronze production and palace wealth suffer. If enemy pressure rises on several borders at once, even a capable king must choose which crisis to answer first. Climate may have played a role, though it should be described carefully. Studies of ancient climate suggest episodes of drought and aridity in parts of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East during the period surrounding the Late Bronze Age collapse. A drought does not automatically destroy an empire, and scholars still debate how severe conditions were in each region. But for a state like Hatti, dependent on agricultural production across a difficult Anatolian landscape, repeated poor harvests could become dangerous. Grain is not only food, it is wages, offerings, military supply, palace storage, diplomatic leverage, and urban survival. When grain becomes scarce, every oath in the archive grows thinner. There are hints that food shortages troubled the wider world. Letters from the Eastern Mediterranean speak of grain shipments and urgent need. Egypt, with its Nile-based agricultural strength, sometimes appears as a source of food for others. Hatti, by contrast, may have faced sharper vulnerability. The Anatolian plateau can support powerful states, but it does not offer the same predictable agricultural spine as Egypt. If weather patterns shift, if routes are unsafe, if fields are abandoned because of war or raiding, pressure builds quickly. Hunger is not dramatic in the way a battle is dramatic, but it can destroy royal authority more deeply. A king who cannot feed his people, army, or gods begins to lose the invisible foundation of rule. War and migration add another layer. The Sea Peoples are often imagined as a single invading horde, but the reality was likely more complex displaced groups, warriors, maritime raiders, migrating families, opportunistic coalitions, and shattered communities moving through a world already under stress. Egyptian records describe them as a major threat. But those records present events through Egyptian royal ideology. In Anatolia and Syria, the evidence is more fragmentary. Some Western Anatolian and coastal disruptions may have affected Hittite stability. Ugarit, a wealthy Syrian coastal city tied into the Hittite sphere, was destroyed around this period, and its archives preserve a world of alarm, military absence, and urgent vulnerability. The last voices from such cities feel less like orderly collapse than like people realizing too late that protection is not coming. Assyria's pressure in the east also matters. Unlike some collapsing states, Assyria does not disappear. It struggles, adapts, and remains a hard power. For Hatti, Assyrian strength threatens the Syrian and Upper Mesopotamian zones that had once been symbols of Hittite success. If the Hittites are forced to divert attention east while also facing problems in Anatolia, Syria, and the West, the imperial system becomes overburdened. The empire's great achievement, its ability to stand between worlds, becomes a liability when these worlds all become unstable at once. Then there is the question of Hattusa itself. The capital appears to have been abandoned and burned near the end of the empire, though the exact sequence remains debated. Some evidence suggests that parts of the city may have been emptied before final destruction, which complicates the image of a sudden massacre. Royal archives, temples, and administrative spaces no longer function as they once did. Whether the city was destroyed by enemies, internal disorder, evacuation followed by burning, or some combination of pressures, the symbolic result is immense. The capital that had restored a cursed site into an imperial heart becomes silent again. What makes this silence so powerful is that Hattusa was not merely a residence. It was the place where the empire remembered itself. Its tablets held treaties, rituals, laws, prayers, and the written architecture of Hittite rule. When that world stops producing records, modern understanding falls into shadow. The last Hittite kings do not leave a neat farewell explaining why the system failed. There is no final tablet saying the empire has ended because of drought, invasion, rebellion, famine, or divine anger. Instead, historians must read the ruin pattern, foreign references, broken archives, abandoned sites, and surviving successor states. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is part of the story. The fall of Hatti also warns against imagining collapse as instant disappearance. The empire falls, but people remain. Farmers do not vanish because a capital burns. Local elites adapt. Soldiers become subjects of new powers. Scribes carry traditions elsewhere or stop writing in old forms. Gods survive under altered names. In northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, successor kingdoms continue many Hittite traditions in new political shapes. The imperial center breaks. But the cultural afterlife is more complicated. Still, the end of the Hittite Empire marks a true rupture. One of the great powers of the Bronze Age, a kingdom that faced Egypt, humbled Babylon, mastered treaties, and ruled from a mountain capital across a web of vassals, no longer stands among the great kings. The international world of royal brotherhood, gift exchange, and palace diplomacy shrinks and changes. Egypt survives but weakens. Assyria endures. New peoples and new states rise. Iron becomes more common in the centuries that follow, not as a sudden Hittite secret, but as part of a changed technological and political landscape. The Bronze Age does not simply end in one night, yet for Hatti, the old world has broken beyond repair. The empire that once tried to bind everything through oath discovers the limit of every oath. No treaty can command rain, No curse can stop hunger. No chariot charge can repair a trade network once cities begin to burn. No archive can preserve authority if the institutions that read it have fallen. The Hittites were not weak because they collapsed. They collapsed because even strong systems can become vulnerable when too many supports fail together, and after Hattusa falls silent. The story does not end in emptiness. It continues in fragments, in successor kingdoms, carved reliefs, old divine symbols, and the ghostly survival of Hittite memory under new names. After Hattusa falls silent, the world does not become empty. That is one of the quiet mistakes people often make when imagining ancient collapse. A capital burns, a dynasty ends, a palace system fails, and the mind wants to see darkness spreading over the map as if every village, shrine, road, and memory has vanished with the throne. But history rarely disappears so neatly. The Hittite Empire breaks, yet the people who had lived under its shadow continue to breathe, farm, worship, trade, carve, marry, fight, and remember. The imperial name fades, but fragments of its world survive in smaller kingdoms, local traditions, and monuments cut into stone beneath a different political sky. In southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, successor states emerge from the wreckage of the old imperial order. Modern scholars often call them Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite kingdoms, though these labels are convenient rather than perfect. Their rulers do not simply rebuild Hattusa in miniature, they inherit pieces of Hittite political culture, Luwian language traditions, local Syrian customs, older urban life, and the new realities of an Iron Age world. Places such as Carchemish, Melid, Gurgum, Kumu, Tabal, and others become centres of power, sometimes small in territory but rich in memory. The empire is gone, yet its southern and southeastern echoes remain visible for centuries. Carchemish is especially important. Once a major Hittite stronghold on the Euphrates, governed by members of the royal family, it survives the imperial collapse and becomes one of the great heirs of Hittite prestige. Its location gives its strength a crossing point, a contact zone, a place where Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia continue to meet. The kings of Carchemish and neighbouring states use monumental art, hieroglyphic inscriptions, royal titles, and divine symbols to express authority. What survives in the record suggests continuity, but not simple continuity. The old empire has shattered, and each fragment must now survive among new pressures. One of the most striking survivals is the use of Anatolian hieroglyphs, often connected with the Luwian language. While the great archives of Hattusa were written mainly in cuneiform on clay, public monuments in the post-imperial world often use hieroglyphic signs carved in stone. These inscriptions preserve names, titles, boasts, dedications, and claims to legitimacy. They show rulers presenting themselves before gods and subjects, standing in a tradition that reaches back into the Hittite world but has adapted to new conditions. The evidence remains incomplete, and many details of identity and language are still debated. But the carved signs prove that Hittite-era cultural forms did not die with the capital. The art of these kingdoms also carries memory forward. Stone reliefs show rulers, storm gods, winged creatures, processions, feasting scenes, lions, warriors, and symbols of divine power. Some figures retain the old visual language of Hittite kingship-pointed shoes, horned divine caps, weapons, raised hands, and formal poses before gods. Yet the style also mingles with Syrian, Assyrian, and local traditions. This is the art of a border world. A world where old imperial inheritance meets new neighbours. It is less the ghost of Hatti than its afterlife in a changed body. Religion survives in similarly layered form. The storm god remains central in many regions, as he had been in the old Hittite and Syrian worlds. Mountain gods, weather gods, sun deities, and local divine powers continue to anchor political authority. The kings of the successor states still need gods to make rule legitimate. They still stand before divine forces as protectors and servants of order. Even when names shift and languages change, the old idea remains. Power belongs not only to men with armies, but to rulers recognized within a sacred landscape. But survival does not mean safety. The Neo-Hittite and Syro-Hittite states live in a harsher geopolitical world. Assyria, which had already been a threat in the final Hittite period, grows into a vast imperial machine. Assyrian kings campaign westward with increasing force, demanding tribute, hostages, submission, and eventually direct control. The small kingdoms that inherit pieces of Hittite tradition must now play the old game of survival under a more relentless power. They send tribute. Rebels submit and are punished. Some are absorbed. Some vanish from independent history. The pattern is familiar, but the scale of Assyrian domination becomes increasingly difficult to resist. This creates one of the great ironies of Hittite memory. The empire that once stood as Egypt's equal and rival of Mitanni leaves behind smaller kingdoms that later appear in Assyrian records as tributaries, enemies, or conquered lands. Their monuments speak with local pride, but Assyrian inscriptions speak with imperial certainty. The old Hittite world is no longer the one setting the terms. It is being translated into the language of a new empire, one that preserves its own victories in stone with ruthless confidence. And yet even conquest cannot fully erase the past. Symbols persist, place names survive, artistic habits travel, deities are renamed, merged, or reinterpreted, royal houses claim descent, memory, or sacred connection to older traditions. The people of these lands do not live as museum pieces preserving a vanished empire for future archaeologists. They live in the present of their own age, but in doing so, they carry forward fragments of Hatti without always needing to call them Hittite. Farther west and north, the picture becomes more obscure. The old Anatolian heartland does not preserve Hittite imperial identity in the same visible way as the southern successor states. Hattusa itself is abandoned, its tablets buried, its walls left to weather. Other peoples and kingdoms rise in Anatolia over time, including Phrygians, Eurachians, Lydians, and others, each with their own histories. The old capital's silence deepens. There is no continuous living memory that keeps the Hittite Empire clear in later classical tradition. By the time Greek and Roman writers describe Anatolia and the Near East, the Hittites as a Bronze Age superpower have largely vanished from recognizable historical consciousness. Some faint echoes may remain in biblical references to Hittites, though connecting these references directly to the old empire is complicated. The term may refer in different contexts to local groups, inherited names, or memories of northern peoples rather than a clear awareness of the imperial Hittite state centered at Hattusa. Scholars still debate these connections carefully, and it is important not to force them into a simple line. What matters is the strangeness of the disappearance. A people who once negotiated with pharaohs and ruled great Syrian cities survive in later memory only in fragments, distortions, and names detached from their full past. The true return of the Hittites has to wait for archaeology, for the patient reading of inscriptions, for clay tablets pulled from the earth, for scholars willing to compare signs, languages, ruins, and distant records. Their afterlife is therefore double. In antiquity, They survive through successor states and absorb traditions. In modern history, they survive through rediscovery. The stones of Hattusa, the monuments of Carchemish, the tablets of the archives, and the carved hieroglyphs together restore a world that had been broken into pieces. After Hattusa, then, there are ghosts. But they are not empty ghosts. They have hands that carve stone, priests who still serve storm gods, kings who still claim sacred favour, scribes who still shape signs, and cities that still stand on the roads between empires. The great capital is gone. The imperial court no longer sends commands across Anatolia and Syria, but the memory of Hatti continues to move beneath new names, waiting for a much later age to recognize that these scattered traces once belonged to a power large enough to challenge Egypt, shake Babylon, and nearly rule the world it knew. The strange fate of the Hittites is that they were never truly small, yet for a long time they seemed almost invisible. Their empire stood among the greatest powers of the late Bronze Age. Their kings spoke to pharaohs as equals. Their armies crossed enormous distances, fought in Syria, struck Babylon, and shaped the politics of cities far beyond the Anatolian plateau. Their scribes preserved laws, rituals, myths, treaties, and royal anxieties in archives large enough to rebuild an entire civilization's outline. And still, when the later world remembered ancient greatness, it remembered Egypt's pyramids, Babylon's towers, Assyria's armies, Greece's epics, and Rome's roads far more easily than it remembered Hatti. The Hittites became a power history nearly forgot, not because they lacked importance, but because the chain of memory around them broke. Part of the forgetting comes from the nature of their capital. Hattusa was magnificent, but it did not remain a living imperial city under later rulers in the way some ancient centres did. It did not become a continuous sacred metropolis visited, rebuilt, renamed, and celebrated for millennia. It fell, emptied, weathered, and waited. Its tablets stayed buried. Its language died from use. Its political air survived mostly in smaller southern kingdoms, then were absorbed by stronger powers. The old Anatolian heart of Hatti did not keep speaking the empire's name clearly to the civilizations that followed. Without living memory, even massive walls can become anonymous stone. Another part lies in writing itself. The Hittites wrote a great deal, but much of what they wrote was trapped in cuneiform tablets and hieroglyphic inscriptions that later ages could not read. A civilization can preserve its voice perfectly and still be silent if no one knows the language. For centuries, the archive of Hattusa existed as buried evidence without listeners. The Hittites had not vanished from the earth, but they had vanished from comprehension. Their return required not only excavation, but decipherment, comparison, and the recognition that a forgotten Indo-European language lay beneath Mesopotamian signs. One of the surprising details of modern rediscovery is that the key to Hittite speech helped widen the history of Indo-European languages themselves. The empire's archive did not merely restore a lost kingdom, it changed the study of language. Their rediscovery also corrected the map of power in the ancient Near East. Before the Hittites were understood, the late Bronze Age could look too Egyptian, too Mesopotamian, too centered on the civilizations whose monuments remained visible and whose records were better known. Hatti forced historians to redraw the balance. Egypt was not alone at the top. Babylon was not beyond northern reach. Syria was not merely a corridor between famous empires. It was a contested centre where Hittite policy mattered profoundly. Anatolia was not a marginal upland waiting for later history. It had already produced one of the great imperial systems of the ancient world. Yet the Hittites do not fit easily into popular imagination. They left no pyramid field, no golden royal tomb like that of Tutankhamun has come to define them. Their greatness is administrative, diplomatic, military, and archival, less instantly visible than a colossal statue against desert light. Their empire is made of roads, treaties, vassal obligations, storm gods, palace records, and difficult landscapes. It requires patience to see. The reward for that patience is a civilization more complex than many simpler legends, a kingdom of iron prestige but not an Iron Age empire, of chariot power but not unstoppable conquest, of sacred kingship but constant internal anxiety, of great treaties but endless fear of betrayal. What survives in the record suggests that the Hittites nearly ruled the world they knew not by conquering every land directly, but by mastering the art of influence across a fractured international system. They understood that a king in a distant city could be more useful as a sworn vassal than as a corpse. They understood that gods, gifts, marriages, hostages, and old favours could bind politics as tightly as spears. They understood that written memory could become a weapon. Their empire was not modern, not gentle, and not stable in any easy sense, but it was intelligent. It solved the problem of ruling diversity by turning diversity into part of the system. The tragedy is that the same system depended on conditions the Hittites could not fully control. Their power rested on connected routes, agricultural supply, vassal obedience, elite cooperation, and the continued existence of a world where great kings recognized one another. When that world fractured around 1200 BCE, Hatti suffered not only invasion or rebellion, but the failure of context. The empire had been built for the late Bronze Age order. When that order changed, the old tools could not save it completely. Scholars still debate the exact combination of drought, war, migration, internal weakness, famine, and political fragmentation, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the result is beyond dispute. The great king of Hatti disappears from the table of great kings. Still, disappearance is not the same as insignificance. The Hittites matter because they reveal how ancient power really worked between the famous monuments. They show that empires can be built in mountains as well as river valleys. They show that law and ritual can stand beside war, that diplomacy can follow slaughter, that a civilization can absorb many peoples without becoming simple, and that collapse can bury not only cities but entire reputations. They remind us that history is not a complete record of what mattered. It is a surviving record of what remained visible, readable, and remembered. So the forgotten Bronze Age power returns slowly, tablet by tablet, gate by gate, broken sign by broken sign. Hattusa no longer commands armies, but it commands attention. Its lions are worn, but still watching. Its walls are ruined, but still trace the shape of ambition. Its archives are damaged, but still speak. The Hittites do not come back as a myth of perfect greatness. They come back as something more interesting, a real civilization, brilliant and anxious, expansive and fragile, capable of shaking the world and then being swallowed by time. In that contradiction lies their lasting power. They nearly ruled their age, then vanished from memory, and their rediscovery proves that the ancient world still contains empires hidden not in fantasy, but in the patient silence of stone and clay. The wind falls softly over Hattusa now. No royal messenger climbs the road with urgent tablets sealed for the palace. No chariot horses stamp in the courtyards. No priest hurries through the gate fearing that one missed offering may anger a god whose name has been carried from some distant conquered land. The city belongs to weather, grass, birds, and the long patience of broken stone. Yet in that quiet, the old empire feels less absent than transformed. Its power no longer moves through armies or treaties, it moves through memory restored after forgetting. Civilizations often imagine themselves as permanent while they are alive. They build gates as if enemies will always stop outside them. They write laws as if the offices that enforce them will always exist. They make treaties as if descendants will honor the same fears and ambitions. The Hittites did all of this with seriousness, intelligence, and force. They were not fools overtaken by a simple disaster. They were builders of a vast and complicated order, and that order endured for centuries before it failed. Their story is sobering because it does not show weakness punished. It shows strength reaching its limits. Across the ancient Near East, the places they touched continue to change. Syria passed through new hands. Assyria rose with harder edges. Egypt endured, older and dimmer than before. Anatolia filled with other kingdoms, other languages, other gods, other names. The Hittites became layered beneath them, like an older road hidden under later roads. For a long time, almost no one could see the route clearly. Then the tablets came back into light, and the buried road began to lead somewhere again. There is comfort, in a quiet way, in knowing that forgetting is not always final. A city may fall silent for 3,000 years and still speak when someone learns how to listen. A name may fade from common memory and still remain pressed into clay. An empire may lose its throne, its capital, and its living language, yet leave enough traces for patient hands to gather it back from darkness. At sunset, the stones of Hattusa do not look like the bones of a dead world so much as the outline of a question time never fully closed. The lions face the empty road. The plateau darkens. Wind moves where royal voices once carried, and somewhere beneath the quiet, the forgotten power of Hatti remains, not ruling now, not commanding, but enduring in the fragile, stubborn memory of the earth.